Hi, and welcome to our webinar on compassion in coaching. It's lovely to see so many of you here today and on a Sunday. Happy Sunday to everybody. I hope that you find this next hour enjoyable. I'm James Farrell and I have a company called the Natural Coaching Company. I'm a professional certified coach and also a chartered environmentalist. And much of my life and my career is about bringing people and nature together for mutual benefit. So some of the coaching work that I do is what I'd call nature-based coaching. It's working in and with nature as a partner in the process. And a big part of that, I think, for me is this subject of compassion. So perhaps we can have a bit of an exploration about that topic together today. I've got no hope that the content I'm going to share with you is something that you will agree entirely with, all of it. If that's the case, please, add your voice in the chat or the discussion, or perhaps just let it go. But I do have hope that what I'm going to share with you and the discussions we have are at least interesting and useful in some way to you in your practice and your life. I wanted to start with a poem, but I couldn't decide which one to go with. There are so many great nature poems. So instead I decided to start with something that His Holiness the Dalai Lama once said, and perhaps you've heard some of this before. My religion is very simple. My religion is kindness. Be kind whenever possible. It is always possible. Our prime purpose in this life is to help others. And if you can't help them, at least don't hurt them. Happiness is not something ready-made. It comes from your own actions. If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. Love and compassion are necessities, not luxuries. Without them, humanity cannot survive. So there are several features of that extract that relate to us as coaches, I think. To help others, to enable happiness, to practice, and to be kind. And what we're going to look at today is why compassion is important to coaching, what the role of compassion is in nature-connected coaching, and how you could develop your natural compassion, let's call it. So what is this thing called compassion? We probably all have our own definitions in our head. I thought I'd share one with you from the Global Compassion Council, which was set up to promote a vision for the world where all life flourishes with compassion. And they have a charter for compassion, which is well worth reading. And it includes the statement that one must work tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures, to dethrone ourselves from the center of our world and put another there. And I find that quite a powerful statement. It's letting go of ego. In a way, it's shifting to eco and even we go. And what about the ICF? We're all members of the ICF, right? We should have compassion written through us like a stick of rock. In the ICF core values, we find the statement that we commit as coaches to being humane, kind, compassionate, and respectful towards others. And others is clearly meant to mean other humans, and I would probably extend that definition to be all others that we share this planet with, human and otherwise. But compassion isn't in our competency framework. So we don't actually measure compassion. We don't seek to acquire it as part of our professional development as coaches, at least under the auspices of the ICF. In fact, it doesn't show up in other bodies either. I've looked in the Association for Coaching. The word that does show up is empathy. Empathy, from the Greek in, and pathos, feeling, is about feeling in somebody else. Okay, but empathy and compassion are not quite the same, and I want to draw a distinction. As coaches, we are expected to show empathy from our clients. Okay, we want to feel in their world because it enables us to develop understanding about them, doesn't it? And the more we understand, the more knowledge we have about our clients, the better able we are to respond to their needs. So empathy is really important. But there is a risk that empathy can trap us. We can become stuck inside another person's emotional world, and that can make it more difficult to create a healthy perspective and distance. More difficult perhaps to recognize our clients as naturally creative, resourceful and whole. And empathy fatigue is something that shows up in many helping professions. It shows up quite probably in coaching, certainly shows up in professions like nursing, and was a major feature in the pandemic here in the UK amongst nursing professionals and doctors. Compassion is slightly different though. The word in English comes from the ecclesiastical Latin, compati, which means suffering with. So rather than suffering in, suffering with. There's a major review of compassion, which is well worth reading, by Goetz, Keltner and Simon Thomas in 2010. And they showed that compassion was a distinct emotion, functionally different from empathy or love, but in the same family as the less active sympathy or pity. And the difference is that compassion includes action. And it helps to define us actually as a pro-social species that depends on the connections with other human beings. And in that major review, Goetz said that this suffering that we might recognize in another motivates a desire to help. And there's some interesting neuroscience around this, where the centers for compassion in the brain link to the centers for action. I was reading a book recently by a Zen priest called Dainin Katagiri, and he shared the Japanese words for compassion, which show up in Zen Buddhism. And there are two characters in Japanese. I hope any Japanese coaches on the call here can confirm this. The first is Ji, which means the desire to give happiness to all beings, and Hi, which means sadness. So compassion is desire to give happiness tinged and companion-like with sadness. And Katagiri also then describes in other forms of Buddhism the two components of compassion that come from the Sanskrit. And I'll share these with you here. So karuna, you probably heard of, is the part of compassion that relates to sadness and suffering. And maitri is the part that relates to kindness and helping. So it's important we recognize, in order to have compassion, we must be suffering and recognize our suffering with others. And then it leads us to take action. So what a perfect emotion, I feel, for coaches to explore and think about in terms of their practice and their lives. What about nature? So there are 5 pathways that researchers have derived that we can follow to deepen our sense of what's called nature connectedness. And they are emotion, the feelings that arise in us when we're engaged with the natural world, how our senses come alive and we notice, perhaps even beyond our senses, to sensitivities like weather and so on. Beauty, natural beauty, an incredibly important driver of happiness and well-being. Meaning that we find in nature, and nature in our lives is an incredibly important pathway. And then, unsurprisingly here, given this webinar, the pathway of compassion. And these pathways were developed by psychologists at the University of Derby and extrapolated by work that was done in the early 1990s, famously by Edward Wilson and Stephen Kellett, on the biophilia hypothesis, which is an exploration of human beings' natural affiliation with the natural world. Nature connectedness is a really powerful driver of human health and well-being. It's thought to be 4 times more important for living a worthwhile life than socioeconomic status. Nature-connected individuals have higher happiness, self-esteem, confidence. These are all classic things that our clients come to coaching for, right? But it's not just about what do we get from nature, which I think is still, there's still a utilitarian context and driver in much of the health, well-being, nature industry at the moment. It's not just about what we get. One of the most powerful things about nature connectedness is that it's linked to the creation of an environmentally responsible individual and the possession of pro-environmental attitudes. So in other words, there is a strong link between nature connection and pro-environmental and pro-nature action. And that some studies recently are now finding is not just a correlation, but actually a causation. So become more nature connected, take more action in daily life that is good for the planet. And that's really important because behavior change, individual behavior change, is thought to contribute something like a third of the action required to keep this planet within 1.5 degrees temperature rise, and around a third of the action, slightly more than a third of the actions required for global nature recovery and nature-based solutions. So not to be scoffed at, the opportunity to develop nature connectedness in our clients, which may well lead then to pro-environmental action in their lives and a ripple effect into their communities, is something that potentially as coaches we could help to create and be part of a positive change that we want in the world. So I think, let's bring this back to compassion. I think there are 4 drivers, I'd suggest, of natural compassion. And to help illustrate this, I've drawn some circles. It's not a very complicated diagram. It's an evolution of a diagram you may have seen from Schultz. It's quite famous. It shows 2 circles, self and nature. And the circles becoming increasingly close together and then eventually overlapping as an individual might start to feel at one with the natural world that they are part of. And there are scales that you can use to test this in people. How much does your self identity overlap with your nature identity? But I've added some more circles on that. So we have ourselves, okay, and there's a selfish driver of natural compassion, I think, which is that we are literally suffering with other earthlings on this planet as a result of largely human-induced impact on ecosystems, environmental health, natural communities. It's a stark fact that we live less long and less healthy lives when we don't have green space close to where we live that we can interact with on a regular basis. Even more bluntly, a lack of nearby nature kills human beings. Lung disease, cardiac disease, depression, other mental health disorders, the science and the medicine is now extremely clear. We are all worse off when we live apart from nature. So there's a selfish driver for that self bubble on there of engaging in natural compassion. And then there's others. Perhaps that other circle represents our clients. And our clients are part of a community of other human beings. And we ourselves are part of, clearly, a community of other human beings. And there may well be some overlap between all 4 of those circles. And I'd suggest that then they sit within the wider circle of nature, Gaia, the ecology, whatever you want to call it. So I'd invite us to think of ourselves as embedded within rather than a circle that overlaps with, because we are nature. We're inhabited by billions of different species bacteria. We breathe in, we breathe out nature. We are an organic life form, as is any other. So I think to see ourselves as embedded in nature is useful. So I said there were 4 drivers, and I dealt with the first one, which was the selfish driver of we're less healthy. Second driver is perhaps linked to the community circles there, that we might recognize that there are deep injustices involved in the unequal distribution of environmental access and quality in the world. For communities that contribute the least to carbon emissions, there's often the most harm inflicted. People, for example, having no choice but to live in areas alongside heavy industry and environmental pollution. And I was listening on the radio this morning to Chiang Mai, for example, and poor farmers now being victim of lung disease from some of the practices that are driven by global maize markets and meat markets. In a taxonomy of compassion, there's a chap called Paul Ekman, and he called this second driver global compassion. And he cites the global response to the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, if you all remember that. The third driver, I think, is that we can all feel a sense of compassion with wildlife that is also suffering. So I talked about human suffering. We know very well that wildlife is suffering too. Here in the UK, one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, since 1970, which happens to be the year I was born, we've lost something like 60 to 70% of animals and plants in terms of quantity. About 15% of species in this country are at risk of extinction. We could have a look at some other examples from around the world. I mean, it's staggering to think that until 1900, so just over 100 years ago, the most common bird in North America was the passenger pigeon. There were 5 billion passenger pigeons in North America, and every single one of them is now extinct. So these three drivers that I've described, all opportunities to extend ourselves to include nature, all drivers perhaps for us to feel that suffering and be motivated to help in any way we can. And I think there is another dimension here, which is the reciprocal compassion that we may feel expressed by the natural world towards us. I don't know if you've ever sat in the crook of a comfortable tree, or you've gone to a certain favorite outdoor space when you feel down or sad, or whether you've hugged a tree or had a bird come and sit on your windowsill. There are moments in which we can feel that nature is actually showing compassion towards us. Not just for pets and creatures like that, which clearly can show us love, but the wild world as well. And I think the sense that we're cared for in, with, and by the more than human world can often arise in nature coaching sessions and in self-coaching with nature. So this leads me on to talking about what natural compassion is then, and with an adaptation from the Global Compassion Coalition, I've come up with these 5 statements. So perhaps natural compassion for us as coaches is to recognize, firstly, the interconnectedness between all human beings, all living beings, to hold empathy for all life forms, to promote environmental justice, to promote more sustainable life choices, and to act to mitigate and adapt to climate and nature crises. And as ICF people, we might want to think about where natural compassion might show up as we work with our clients to integrate their awareness, their choices into their worldview and into their behaviours. I could do a whole hour on this alone, but I think those words from facilitates clients' growth, the intention to integrate learning into a client's worldview and behaviours, is really relevant to natural compassion. What is that worldview if it doesn't include the world, if it doesn't include the natural world? So in a way that relates to our coaching mindset, doesn't it? Our ability to stay open to context, to culture. So are we curious? Are we asking questions about a client's context in terms of their interactions with the environment that they live in, that they work in? Or are we just asking questions of context in more traditional ways relating to their job, where their office is, those kinds of things? Part of the coaching mindset as well is about our ability as coaches to regulate our emotion, to mentally and emotionally prepare for sessions, and developing our own nature connectedness practice is incredibly valuable for that, with all of the good science about how nature allows us to manage our emotions and to stay calm. And it's also clearly then about evoking awareness. And this is perhaps a little bit more utilitarian, but being outdoors with clients in nature just presents us with a vaster array of immediate metaphors, allegories, opportunities to bring more awareness to our clients as a result of being outdoors in nature. I mean, perhaps play comes there and their exploration of their natural child when we're outside. Perhaps there are other ways that they can start to create relationships with places so that they can maintain their insights and maintain their learning in between sessions and after their coaching finishes. So just to touch on those three competencies, I think that particularly are rich places to put through the lens of natural compassion. So I've talked for a long time now, and I'm going to stop in a minute. So this is a chance for us to be in a practice for about 10 minutes, maybe slightly less than 10 minutes. So it's going to be quite spacious, be quite relaxed. I'm going to play, in a minute, I'm going to play a recording of a dawn chorus of birds from a place called the Knepp Estate in Sussex in the south of the UK. This has become quite a famous project to bring back large herbivores and mammals into a landscape that was intensively farmed in order to enable a transformation for wildlife in a place that was, like most farmlands in this country, extremely damaged, where songbirds were declining. The Knepp Estate project has really been a roaring success, and many species are now blossoming and blooming again, thanks to this emergent way of thinking about landscape management. So I'm going to play a dawn chorus that was recorded there quite recently by a sound artist called Hazel Reeves. And I'm going to, as it's playing, I'm going to give you some prompts. So it's almost going to be like a guided meditation or mindfulness session if you're used to doing those. And the prompts come from a practice called Be Kind, which is in the book Being in Nature by myself and Lee Evans. So please be comfortable. Close your eyes if you like, or perhaps go into a soft gaze and listen to the recording. So take some breaths to start with, from the belly, if you can. Don't have to breathe in any particular way. If you feel any tension in your body, just release from your neck, your shoulders, your legs, your jaw. My first invitation is for you to just try and visualize and distinguish the birds that you hear. Just picture in your mind the kind of landscape they may be singing in, which involves woods, open grassland, some water, bushes and scrub, maybe some mist as it's dawn and the sun is yet to appear over the horizon. Perhaps you can hear different kinds of birds. Maybe if you've got headphones on, you can sense the direction they might be. What can you hear to your left? What can you hear to your right? What can you hear in front of you, behind you? And the next invitation is to engage with the part of compassion, karuna, which is about sadness and suffering. Perhaps you feel this in your head or maybe in your chest, the unfortunate state of nature in the planet at the moment. Let's just gently feel what that is like. Perhaps not just nature now, but nature over preceding decades. The loss, maybe a sense of grief. Perhaps you can feel their pain and your own. Perhaps there's some personal sadness and loss in there, and if so, I share some words from the Dalai Lama, who suggests that underlying those uncomfortable feelings, there's an invitation to alertness and determination. Because this is voluntary, we're voluntarily and deliberately accepting another's suffering for a higher purpose. So that's my third invitation, is let your natural response arise now. Perhaps you might like to focus on your heart area. You could even put a hand there. What is that feeling of kindness and compassionate action that sits there now? Wanting nature to be free from suffering. See if you can feel the compassion of the natural world entering into you when you breathe in and out. Perhaps you could invite that feeling into your heart. See if you can send the compassion that you feel in your heart out into the world through your breath. Send it out to all of the colleagues on this webinar. Send it out to your friends and your loved ones. Send it out to the natural world near where you live. And perhaps there's a feeling of connectedness and commitment in there, a willingness, and a feeling of freshness. And just sit with that for another minute or so before we finish. And then gently come back into the room. Thank you. So we're going to continue a conversation now, or begin a conversation, in fact, in small groups. So I'm going to invite you into breakout room. Please engage with that in any way you would like to. Share the time. Please listen to one another without judgment, as I am sure you will. And there are a couple of prompts. The first is just to share, what do you experience during that practice? And secondly, to start to talk about how does compassion already show up in your work, and how might it show up even more?